I directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. Where's the gold?
This is the Gold Newsletter podcast. Fergus Hodgson, your host. Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like more economic freedom, mining precious metals, please do hit that subscribe button. We have a repeat guest, one who did a great job last time, Daniel J. Mitchell. He is the founder, president of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. That's just freedomandprosperity.org. Make sure I've got that right, freedomandprosperity.org. He holds a PhD from George Mason University in economics, and he is a specialist in fiscal policy. So, Dan, welcome back to the show. I'm so pleased. We had a great chat last time discussing Puerto Rico and, let's say, tax havens, the future or lack thereof that they have. And this time, I'd really like to focus more on just the future of the United States, the fiscal future, because many of our listeners know that there's depending on how you calculate it, let's say $100, $200 trillion of unfunded liabilities. It's out of control. And the fiscal gap just seems to keep just getting wider or hanging around. Does that mean in the coming year or years, the U.S. will see a major structural tax increase? Is that just inevitable?
If you were to ask me to put money on the line, America's fiscal future is very bad. We are going to be hit by huge, significant tax increases, both the class warfare tax increases that target the rich, higher income tax rates, capital gains tax rate increases, a higher death tax. We already see some politicians like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren pushing for wealth taxes. And that, hearing that list, ordinary people might think, oh, okay, no big deal. That's not me. Those class warfare taxes won't put much of a dent in the giant unfunded liabilities that the country faces because of poorly designed entitlement programs. The only way, well, there's really only two ways that we go forward. Either we reform the entitlements and sort of bend that cost curve of government down so that government's no longer growing faster than the private sector, or we do the class warfare taxes and huge tax increases on ordinary people. In effect, we have a European fiscal future, and that probably means European taxes, i.e., a huge value-added tax, sort of a hidden national sales tax, which hits low-income and middle-class people. It means huge payroll tax increases on ordinary people. It means European-style income taxes, which means not just higher tax rates on the rich, but in countries like Denmark, you're paying 50% tax rates as a middle income worker. So I am very, very worried about the future of the United States, because if we continue to have government grow and grow without reform, not to mention the fact, of course, that Biden and a lot of politicians in Washington want to actually make it even bigger and have it grow even faster, it's very hard to be optimistic about America's future, given the facts that we're faced with.
So we have both established entitlements, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and then all, let's say, the public pensions and retirement schemes. And then we have, let's say, this future of, I hate to say it, but social engineering or environmentalism, which will make us much less productive if enforced. Is there any way out of this, right? Do you see any way to reverse this trend of basically a less productive economy and a higher expense rate on the federal government's books?
It's very simple to fix the problems. It's just not easy, because what do politicians like to do? They like to play Santa Claus. They like to appease different interest groups. They like to give away goodies. We used to have what was considered an unwritten fiscal constitution, which is that politicians understood that, well, you can't just endlessly, just spend money and run up debt. Well, unfortunately, that unwritten fiscal constitution has, if not completely eroded, 99% eroded. And so, and I'm not making a partisan point, by the way, because yes, Biden is terrible on fiscal policy, but Trump was spending trillions of dollars. The coronavirus pandemic came around, spend trillions of dollars. Biden takes office, spend trillions of dollars. And now that the pandemic's in the rearview mirror, what are politicians doing? Spend trillions of dollars. I mean, it is almost inconceivable that we have a group of people in Washington who basically pay no attention to the future. Why? Because the only future they care about is when their next election cycle comes up. And so, this is the whole school of public choice economics, which is when you apply economic analysis to political behavior, and you realize that politicians are self-serving. They want power, they want money, they want votes, and they think about today. They don't think about tomorrow. And unfortunately, that condemns our children and grandchildren to a very, very grim future unless we somehow get some sort of just rejuvenated interest in the idea of limited government and basic fiscal responsibility. But unfortunately, I just don't see it, at least not, well, certainly not in the next 2 years. And it's kind of hard to be optimistic in what happens in 2024 and beyond.
The point you make about this not being a problem of partisanship, although maybe there are slight differences, is well taken. Does that just mean that it's not a personnel problem, that it's a structural or constitutional problem of the United States?
Well, it is a structural constitutional problem in the sense that our founding fathers gave us a system where, if you look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the so-called enumerated powers, the federal government's powers were very, very limited and constrained. The founders did not want a big, overarching, bloated central government in Washington. Unfortunately, basically starting under FDR, arguably the second worst president in American history after Woodrow Wilson, starting with FDR, we basically had a court that said, oh, Article 1, Section 8 was just for advisory purposes only. Or, they didn't say it that way, but that's basically the net result of their decisions. And now, I guess about 10 years ago, whatever it was, we had the Obamacare decision where could the federal government order you to buy a private insurance policy? And the Supreme Court basically, well, not all of them, but John Roberts sided with the left and said, yeah, I guess so. Why not? So there's literally nothing that the courts will say is not a legitimate role of the federal government. And that's our structural problem. We are no longer within the guardrails that the founding fathers set up to limit the power of Washington. And as a result, over decades, politicians in Washington, as part of their usual vote buying exercises, had made government bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, every so often, during the Reagan years and a few other times, there's a bit of retrenchment, but we never bring government back down to where it was. So we have this sort of ratchet where government is always going up and up and up. And again, what we just talked about, the future, looking at the long run fiscal forecasts, I mean, the United States almost certainly is condemned to a Greek Italian style economic and fiscal future.
Yeah, so in some regards, I tend to agree with you that there's almost a constitutional crisis now, in that the federal government is so beyond the Constitution's enumerated powers that one wonders, is there even any relationship anymore? Now, that's the note about the Greek crisis as a corollary or parallel is interesting because in many ways, maybe because of the strength of the US dollar historically, the United States has been able to get away with far more, let's say, profligate or reckless spending than, say, the Canadians or other countries that have had a little bit of, almost without, not necessarily deliberately, but they had a little bit of more fiscal conservatism just because the institutions are maybe better. I'm not sure. I look at even New Zealand, for example, that we wouldn't have debts as absurd as the United States, not because we have such capitalist voters, just because there's some sort of institutional conservatism. Does the vastness of the U.S. debts and unfunded liabilities mean that we really are headed towards more of a crisis scenario that could get out of hand quickly?
I'm not sure what how we would define quickly. But part of your question reminds me that the U.S. does have the dollar, the world's reserve currency. Now that's eroding a little bit over time, but having the world's reserve currency does give the United States more leeway to be profligate. So it's good to be the world's reserve currency. The US, in effect, gets some economic advantages from that, but it's bad in the sense that it gives our politicians a little more leeway to be irresponsible. And think of it this way. You have a balloon blowing up, blowing up, blowing up, blowing up. The more it blows up, when it bursts, the more damage it's going to do. So yes, we have this leeway, but it enables us to make these irresponsible decisions. And when the chickens come home to roost, I'm going to mix my metaphors, balloons and chickens. But when the chickens come home to roost, it's just not going to be pretty. I mean, here's the thing to understand when you're looking at countries and what debt levels they can withstand. If you're Argentina and you just defaulted over and over again in your history, and international investors look at your government, and it's just decades and decades of these horrible Peronist, populist, big government politicians from all the different parties, basically. Are you going to buy Argentinian government bonds? Probably not. Or if you do buy them, you're going to be very, very cautious. You're going to look at Argentina's current debt levels. You're going to look at what interest rate you're getting on the bonds to compensate you for risk and stuff like that. And you're probably going to say, well, gee, if Argentina's debt levels get to 40% of GDP, I'm bailing because I just don't trust them to maintain that level of debt. On the other hand, if you're an international investor and you're looking at Japan with decades and decades of stable governance, even though their debt levels are way higher, well over 200% of GDP, you probably still trust the Japanese government to pay the interest and principal on the bonds that you bought from them. Now, in the long run, I think Japan faces just as bad, if not worse, problems than the United States because their demographics are so challenging. Very few children, lots of old people. That's very difficult to imagine how your long run fiscal policy is going to work with that. But there's no. I guess the bottom line is there's no magic point. There was this famous study. I think Rogoff and Reinhardt, or a couple of economists, had a study saying when governments get to 90% of GDP in terms of their debt levels, that's when everything blows up. No, that's not true at all. That might be an average, but obviously people are going to look at Argentinian debt with a much more skeptical eye than they'll look at, say, debt from the Netherlands or Finland or some other country that's viewed as being prudent and responsible. And where the U.S. fits in, we're closer to Finland and the Netherlands than we are to Argentina. And we do have this reserve currency, which does give us some leeway. But again, that leeway is going to backfire on us because it's enabling the politicians to just do so many irresponsible things today.
It's a useful analogy you make about the balloon. The more you can inflate the balloon, the more it can make a big pop afterwards. And that's my concern with the United States, that because the US does still have a relatively productive economy and it still has the reserve currency, the country can get away with running up its debts so much more than Argentina, for example. And that just means that if those two things go away and there's a run, people just don't want to buy US bonds anymore to hold the US dollar. I mean, whether that will happen anytime soon, I'm not sure, but it's a more precarious position. So we see this, and I try to be a little bit optimistic here. Are there some pressures for good? So, for example, does the United States face tax competition, right? Are other countries, I mean, for example, even the Canadians, as far as I know, have lower taxes on dividend returns or capital gains versus the United States. Is that somewhat of a form of discipline? Does the federal government even pay attention to that?
We talked earlier about the theory of public choice, which is the economic analysis of political behavior, and how politicians have this big incentive to be irresponsible because they're focused on maximizing votes, power, and money, not about what's in the best interest of the country. Fortunately, there is a offsetting force that sort of ties their hands a little bit, and that is jurisdictional competition, specifically tax competition. If politicians get too greedy, if they're raising taxes, if they're trying to really punish investors and savers and entrepreneurs and innovators, well, guess what happens? Jobs and investment will move to countries where they're being treated better. Now, obviously, there's a limit to that. People have ties to their homeland, they have ties to their community. But on the margin, if enough jobs, if enough investment, if labor and capital are shifting over time from the high tax jurisdictions to the low tax jurisdictions, that does tie the hands of politicians somewhat. And we had a very good period of tax competition in the global economy, basically starting with the Reagan and Thatcher tax cuts. You had countries all over the world that were lowering tax rates, in many cases by dramatic amounts. Why? Not because they wanted to. They weren't reading my studies. They weren't perusing the writings of Hayek and Friedman. Politicians were lowering tax rates because they felt they had no choice. The geese with the golden eggs were flying away. That's the good news. The bad news, of course, is that politicians understood that was happening. And that's why, working through international bureaucracies like the OECD, they put in place these harmful tax competition projects where, oh, how evil it was, how bad it was for some countries to have zero income taxes or to have low tax rates. That's unfair. That's putting competitive pressure on us. And so they came up with tax haven blacklists. And that process has evolved where today now we're dealing with so-called global corporate minimum taxes. And rest assured that if politicians get their way, if they continue to try to erode tax competition, it's just a matter of time before they harmonize personal income tax rates. They basically want to create a tax cartel because they realize that tax competition is a threat. It inhibits their ability to buy votes with other people's money financed by class warfare tax policy. So yes, we have a major problem with politicians being greedy. We have one good thing, tax competition, that potentially limits their greed, but the politicians are, of course, trying to create this global tax cartel, so there is no more competition. And if they've already partially succeeded, and if they fully succeed, then my already pessimistic outlook on the global economy is just going to get that much worse.
Yeah, that will. Just to be more specific, though, does the United States face any legitimate tax competition threats from peer nations at this moment in time? I just can't think of any. I mean, maybe Singapore, but I wouldn't really consider that a peer nation.
When you're looking at global tax competition, you have to realize that there are multiple different layers of it. There's competition on personal income tax rates. In that regard, of course, the best places to be are Monaco, Cayman, Bermuda, where there's zero income tax. But the U.S., while I think our tax rates are too high, they tend to be better than you find in European countries. And then, of course, some of the East Asian tiger economies, they're not as good as Hong Kong, they're not as good as Bermuda and Cayman and Monaco, but they tend to have low tax rates on personal income. But on corporate income, the U.S. historically was one of the worst countries. And for a while before the 2017 tax cuts, the U.S. literally had the highest corporate income tax rate in the developed world. Now, we're now more around the average level. So we made a lot of progress by reducing the federal rate from 35% to 21%. So we no longer stick out like a sore thumb. But then, of course, there are other taxes you want to focus on. We already, earlier in the program, we talked about how lower income and middle class people in Europe just get killed with these high value added taxes, with extortionary payroll and income taxes. Basically, as a low income, middle income person in Europe, you're lucky to have 50% of your gross salary as take home pay. And then with that little amount of money that you keep from your take home pay, when you go out and spend it, the government's taking another 20 to 25% of it with the value added tax. So the U.S. is much, much better on treating lower income and middle class people well. We do tend to have a very punitive system for taxing capital, which of course is the most mobile factor of production. So that doesn't make sense. in a globalized economy. So different countries have strong points and weak points, I guess, is the bottom line.
The Gold Newsletter is proudly sponsored by Inventa Capital Corporation, a venture capital advisory firm dedicated to the acquisition and development of assets in the natural resource sector. Today, Inventa is one of the premier mining groups with a first-rate portfolio of companies and a world-class team.
This is the Inventa Capital Mining Update. I've got Chris Donaldson of Tin One Resources with me. That's tin1.ca. They're on the Toronto Venture Exchange at TORC or over the counter at over the counter TORCF. And they've got a few projects in Australia, specifically in Tasmania, the Great Pyramid Project. And Chris has just returned from Australia. So what is the latest on the ground?
Yeah, well, hey, thanks for having me, Fergus here. Yeah, it was pretty exciting. Good to get down there. Second time I've now been to site. Yeah, I mean, first of all, the market in Australia is quite a bit more positive than it has been up here in North America. So that was good. We were attending a conference beforehand, and then managed to get over to site with a few people. Yeah, and impressed with what we saw. We still have one drill going at Great Pyramid. If you remember, we have about a 5,000 meter program that we've been executing on for the last 6 months. We've released about 3,500 meters worth of assays and so on. I mean, the goal of the drilling program Great Pyramid, of course, has a historical resource on it, 10,000 contained tons at 0.2%. So, 0.2% for, what would likely be an open pit operation is pretty good grade. But 10,000 tons is a bit small. So our goal is first to, confirm the historical resource, but also test laterally and at depth. So yeah, a couple of weeks ago, we released our last batch of results, and they continue to exceed what we were hoping for there. Managed to find the big hole was a deeper hole that found mineralization around 150 meters. So the original resource went from surface down to only about 40 meters. So now we're seeing mineralization 3 times deeper, which is fantastic. And if you remember the results just before that, we hit our best hole. We had almost 80 meters at 0.51% tin, including 23% at over 23 meters at over 1%. So 80 meters at 0.51. That's double the depth and 2.5 times the grade. So we're hitting on everything. We're just wrapping up the last deep drill hole now, and then of course there's always a bit of a lag before you get the assays back, but we'll get those and start putting out more releases in the next month or two, and then see if we have enough there to update the resource, which we hope to be able to do in the early new year.
Great, mate. So basically more information, more data coming out very soon. And you referred to more optimism down under, and also since we last spoke, there has been somewhat more positive news just for tin more broadly. So what is the industrial demand pushing that?
Yeah, so I mean, if you go back 3 years, first of all, there's a structural deficit in tin. We're just not producing enough to meet demand. The main driver is solder, which is the glue that holds all electrical parts together, semiconductors and solar panels and batteries. Is the glue that holds the batteries together, right? And that the forecast long term is very, very positive and expected to grow 2 to 4% a year for the next decade or so. But the issue is more on the supply side. So 2.5 years ago, you were seeing the squeeze, and the price went from below 20,000 a ton to an all-time high of 50,000 a ton, peaking last March. And that's just simply because of the supply-demand fundamentals. But what did happen is China, which is a net importer, their factories and because of COVID, slowed down, and so they had excess supply. They flooded the market, and we saw an epic collapse. And that coincided with obviously our share price as well. So we went from 50,000 down to under 17,000 per ton in an 8-month period. So it's a wild swing. Thankfully, in beginning of November, inventory levels have come way down, and China is now importing again, and we've seen a rebound. So it's gone from under 17,000 to almost 24,000 per ton right now. So that's a 40% bounce back in 5 weeks, and hopefully we'll be able to resume that long-term trend, which is very, very positive. We haven't quite seen the effect on the equities yet, but as if it continues on this run, hopefully we see the rush back into tin that we saw last year when the tin market was very, very exciting.
When you say the equities are just, let's say, waiting to absorb that, is it just because it's a less efficient market, a smaller market, or what do you think they're less swept?
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things. I mean, one, the tin market is not like copper, which is massive, right? Tin market is very, very small. It trades, $1 million a day across all the tin equities. And so, it's good and bad. When it catches a bid, you get very good leverage. And we saw that last year. But you need to get that flow coming in. I think people are looking to see, okay, is this going to be a sustained rally? And then, if they want to play and add a bit of tin into their portfolios, generally they start at the producers and get down to us developer explorers. And inflows are starting with the producers, and hopefully that'll move down. I mean, we joined the International Tin Association. We're one of 10 explorer developers out there. So if for anybody, these battery metal funds or people want to have some exposure to tin, there are very few companies. But like anything, a rising tide floats all boats. So hopefully that'll catch on here in the new year.
And so, you mentioned the Great Pyramid, which is maybe your flagship right now, but you've got a couple of others. Do you want to comment on their status?
Yeah, so we have 2 other projects. One's called Aberfoyle, and this is a district that is a historical producer, produced over 2 million tons of tin underground at about 1%. But hasn't seen any modern exploration since it was shuttered in the 80s. And at that time, they were chasing these big high-grade veins. Didn't really have a lot of planning. So we're doing an extensive soil survey and mapping, and the goal in that is to see the extent of the known veins and also discover some new targets, so that once we update our resource and are kind of done with this initial program at Great Pyramid, we'll be ready to go over at Aberfoyle. And it's Aberfoyle, and then our third project was Rattler Range. All of them are within about an hour and a half drive of each other. Rattler Range, earlier stage, but has 42 known tin occurrences on it, very highly prospective. And we're doing the same sort of thing. So we're doing mapping and soil sampling on that as well.
Right on, folks. If you want to learn more about Chris's project with Tin One Resources, it is tin1.ca, TORC, or over the counter at TORCF, if you'd like to include it in your portfolio. Otherwise, Chris, thanks for your time. I look forward to our next chat.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Fergus.
Yeah, that's the real challenge, that unfortunately the peer nations that we might hope to compete with us are almost worse. They're further down the track. And many Americans just don't seem to be aware of the fact of just what you said, that these touted European nations and of Irish descent, that's where I spent some time, they basically freeze their working class in the working class. It's very hard to get out if you're being taxed at 50% from a very low level of income. You have so little discretionary income to be an entrepreneur or to invest and save, and you're just surviving from generation to generation, unfortunately. And people forget too that even when you look at the size of houses in a place like Ireland or many European nations, they have much less than Americans. They just live in a more humble existence. Now, Let's get a bit more specific too to what's on the table. I know you follow these things closely. What is going on in Capitol Hill? Are there particularly important proposals on the table, legislative agendas that could come to fruition in the near future, or are we just going to be in this unknown zone where we don't have a clear budget, we don't know what the tax system is going to be, we're just kind of making it up as we go along? It's very ad hoc.
Because of the midterm elections, Republicans will control the House of Representatives, and that means that there won't be any major legislation in Washington. Now, that's good news because Biden had his so-called Build Back Better plan. Now, that wound up because he didn't have, even though the Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate the past 2 years, the margin of the Senate was so narrow that he just never got the votes necessary to pass the full like $4 to $5 trillion. Just it was basically the European welfare state express train legislation. He didn't have the votes for that. He did get a pared down version, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which of course was followed by much higher inflation. So politicians give their bills very strange names. But
Yeah.
Biden, of course, wanted to, and I'm sure still wants to do his original Build Back Better plan with massive per child handouts, massive expansions of the rest of the welfare state, punitive class warfare taxes everywhere you look. There's no way that happens with Republicans in control of Congress, at least of the House of Representatives. Now, having said that, obviously with Republicans only controlling the House, even if they wanted to do the right thing, and of course that's a big question because under Trump they became big government, big spenders themselves. But even if they sort of went back to Reaganism, obviously if they passed a good budget, the Senate wouldn't pass it, Biden wouldn't approve it. So we're looking at gridlock for the next 2 years. Now, gridlock is better than moving in the wrong direction, but it also means that you're not making progress either.
What I mean by this era of basically not addressing the problems, I make that claim because back when I was an undergraduate in the mid 2000s, we had this prominent professor at Boston University, Larry Kotlikoff, who's an expert on generational accounting and these unfunded liabilities. And he said that, and he came up with a plan basically for higher income taxes and a whole bunch of cuts or reforms to Medicare and Social Security. And I thought his book, The Coming Generational Storm, which many people should read, it's still relevant, would have an effect. But what actually happened is that nothing has happened, and that all that's happened is just the gap has just grown and grown and grown, and we're just printing the difference. Is that what we can expect, just permanently higher inflation?
We have not been printing the difference in the United States. We've been borrowing the difference.
Okay.
If you're Argentina and nobody trusts you and they don't want to buy your government debt, what do? You have the central bank buy your government debt, and the central bank just creates money out of thin air, and you wind up, as you so often see in Argentina, with rapid rates of inflation. Now, obviously, we've had inflation recently break out. Was that because we needed to finance our government spending by printing money? No, the U.S. is still considered, or U.S. to be more specific, U.S. government bonds, U.S. treasuries, as people sometimes call them, are still considered a safe asset. And they are, in the sense that I'm sure at no point in the next 20 years is there any risk of the U.S. government defaulting on its obligations to bondholders around the world. So whether you're Chinese, whether you're Argentinian, whether you're a Dutch life insurance company, whether you're a Japanese pension fund, buying U.S. government debt doesn't pay you a very high return, but it's considered a safe asset. So we have not had to print money to finance our government spending because there are still lots of people around the world who are willing to lend the U.S. government money to finance its spending. The reason we have inflation today is because the Federal Reserve, when the coronavirus pandemic began, they panicked. And just like the Bank of England, just like the European Central Bank, they just dumped all sorts of new money into the system by technically expanding their balance sheet. They were buying up government bonds because that's usually the
Well,
way
that yeah.
open market operations operate. But they weren't buying the bonds because nobody else would buy them. That was the only way for government to finance its debt. They were buying the bonds for Keynesian reasons. Oh, the economy might be in danger, so let's just dump a lot of money into the system. And you know what? At the beginning of the pandemic, think back to like March of 2020, when everyone thought the world was going to come to an end, we were all going to die, and there's going to be the zombie apocalypse, basically. I don't particularly blame the Fed or the ECB or the Bank of England for stepping on the accelerator of money printing, figuratively speaking, at the time. What I do blame them for is not stopping. By the time we got to the fall of 2020, when it was obvious the economy wasn't going to fully collapse, and that vaccines were on the way, and that normalcy had semi returned to the economy, that's when these central banks should have said, "Oh, okay, oh, let's go ahead now, hit the brakes," after stepping on the accelerator. But they didn't do that all through the rest of 2020 and all through 2021. If you look at the balance sheet spreadsheets for central banks, they just kept buying more and more and more and more assets, i.e. government bonds, for their balance sheets. So they were just creating money hand over fist for basically 2 years. And of course, sooner or later, when you do that, the inflation genie is going to come out of the bottle. So I guess the bottom line is, in some countries, inflation is caused by deficit spending in the sense that the central bank is the only buyer of the government bonds. And so they print money to buy the government bonds, but it's always money creation by central banks that causes inflation in the long run. It's the deficit spending is only the trigger for it if the central bank makes that decision to be the financier of government spending.
Well, I'll have to look back and see what percentage of US treasuries is now being held or bought, monetized by the Federal Reserve. From memory, it's a substantial amount, maybe more than any one single country, but it probably is not a majority yet. So you're right that still, although it defies my comprehension sometimes, even though the real returns are heavily negative on US treasuries, people are willing to buy them. So right now, so you don't think we're necessarily paying for it through inflation, it's just through future obligations.
Well, here's a very important...
for trillion-dollar deficits year in, year out, basically, it's not being paid for through higher prices, but through future obligations.
Well, this is a good opportunity to explain something very important. Our problem is not deficit spending. Our problem is government spending. Because whether you're financing government by taxing the private economy, whether you're financing government by borrowing from the private economy, or as we just talked about, whether you're financing it by printing money, it's the government spending itself that diverts resources from the productive sector of the economy. So I don't like deficit finance spending, but I don't like tax financed or money printing financed government spending either. That's what is sapping the vitality of the private economy. We want more resources, more labor and capital in the private sector, where it will be productively allocated on the basis of what consumers actually want, rather than government programs. Now, to be fair, not all government spending is bad for the economy. I mean, it's good to have rule of law, functioning court system. I suppose if you're avoiding pork barrel spending and stuff like that, it's good to have infrastructure. If it wasn't for our horrible government monopoly school systems, I'd be saying, yes, it's good to spend money on education that builds human capital. And, so there's all sorts of wrinkles and different layers when you're analyzing government spending. But the bottom line is the vast majority of our federal budget is now just tax and transfer entitlement programs, which in no way have a productive impact on the economy. And whether we're financing these entitlements by taxing, borrowing, or printing money, it's still going to be negative. Now, obviously, different ways of financing government can augment the damage above and beyond just the damage of the spending itself. So if you finance your government by printing money like Argentina or Zimbabwe, you'll have high inflation. If you finance your spending with just lots of borrowing from private credit markets, you'll wind up eventually with a Greek or Italian style fiscal crisis. And if you finance your government with taxes, sure, you might have a balanced budget over time, but maybe you'll become like the Nordic nations, where instead of being, the richest countries in the world, over time you sort of lose your vitality and your growth rates, and you slowly but surely become less prosperous compared to other countries that don't make that mistake.
Yeah, it's likely a mix of those two together. And the point you make is an important one that, yes, the federal government, and not just the federal government, but lower governments too, they are borrowing and creating obligations for the future, but at the same time, they're diverting resources, right? Because, of course, they're taking precious capital away from other options. So it is not just like it's a free lunch for the current time period and only we'll deal with it in the future. You're hurting people right now also. So, yeah, we've raced through the half hour, actually. I didn't realize we'd gone so quickly. But I guess I always think too, how can the individual engage with this topic, right? He sees this rather bleak future for taxes. And does that just mean he's got to try to hold, as we obviously promote here on the show, hold tangible assets, or is he just going to have to prepare for a more austere existence in the future?
Well, if I knew the right answer to that, I'd be doing that strategy myself already. The challenge, as I'm sure you know, is that uh, if you're buying precious metals, yes, it's a great hedge, and if everything else goes to what, you wind up in a very strong position. On the other hand, you're missing out on getting returns from investment in companies, stocks, and bonds and stuff like that. And I'm not smart enough or proficient enough to know when is the time to be in metals, when is the time to be in stocks and bonds, when is the time to just be in cash. I mean, that's not my area of expertise. I just know that some types of government policies will cause certain bits of damage to the economy, in some cases in the short run, in some cases in the long run. But I'm not smart enough to know how to time all these things.
Yeah, of course, if you are just holding precious metals, that is purely for wealth protection, not for growth. So there's sterile assets in that regard, which is correct. And if you want to get leverage, that's why we often have mining companies on, because you'll get much more of like I said, a levered return from gains. Yeah, it is. I mean, there's no real easy way around this, like you said, because the entitlements, the big ticket spending items for the federal government, they are 100% unproductive, right? You're not, if you're, I hate to say this, but if you're just sending money to retired people who are actually the wealthiest class of our society, you're not promoting work. It has no productive capacity. You're purely taking it from the younger or working generations. Okay, I was trying to leave with a bit more of a positive note there, Dan. And I often try to think, because I live in the United States now. I'm somewhat vested in this country. I really want her to prevail, to maintain whatever exceptionalism she still has. And I think the most optimistic element for me is basically the growth of parallel economy, of people who are finding ways around this monstrosity in the federal government, be it in private education or private medical care or whatever it may be. And in some ways, for example, if we could get people to not rely on all these entitlements and to find ways around the federal government, that would be almost like a form of internal competition. Now, do you want to give a brief comment on that, or that's about all we can say about it?
Our founding fathers, in addition to wanting a very limited central government, and that's why we have Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers, they wanted that as a structural system of government. I don't know that they understood or appreciated how that was a very good idea because it meant innovation, diversity, and competition among the states. And we're experiencing that right now. California has extortionary tax rates. Right next door, Nevada has no income tax, and Arizona now has a low 2.5% flat tax. And the same thing, of course, is all across the country. You have New Hampshire with no state income tax, and you have other states in the Northeast with very high taxes. You have all this migration of jobs and businesses and people to places like Texas and Florida with their no state income tax. But it's not just income taxes. Some states now have school choice, and other states, of course, the government teacher unions basically control the system, and you wind up with an inferior educational product. You have different states that do have more pro-market licensing laws where the government, you don't have to get necessarily nearly as much permission from the government to open and run a business. So I'm a huge fan of decentralization of federalism. I greatly admire Switzerland because that's a country where their decentralized system of federalism has by and large been well protected and maintained, whereas over time, again, starting back in the 1930s, really, under the very bad Supreme Court we got under FDR, we've lost a lot of our federalism. Switzerland still has that federalism. It's an incredibly successful country, especially compared to the welfare states that surround it that are suffering. So what I would advise people in the United States, Switzerland is sometimes called the sister republic because their constitution was based on ours. They've just done a better job of preserving it. And if we want a better, more prosperous economy with more innovation, we really need to try to get back to the decentralization, limited central government that our founding fathers envisioned. And we can look at Switzerland as a modern day role model for how to make that happen.
Yeah, Switzerland is a good example because, I mean, of course, they have a much smaller population, so it's maybe easier to manage or to handle than this, 300 million person plus population. The Tax Foundation has some great diagrams and indexes of the federal taxation or federal tax competition between the competition in a pro-federalism manner. Now, if you want to learn more about Dan Mitchell's work, it's danieljmitchell.wordpress.com. You can also go to freedomandprosperity.org. He's active on Twitter also. Dan, mate, thanks for your time. I look forward to the next chance we have.
Great. Enjoyed chatting with you.